Okay. So good evening, everyone. Welcome back to the Chevrei Tzedek Congregation Scholar in Residence Program with Professor Jerome Copulsky. So this is my last opportunity to publicly thank the Max Center for Jewish Education, which is an agency of the Associated Jewish Charities, for providing the JEEP grant, the Jewish Educational Enhancement Projects Fund grant, which made this possible. Today's Q&A is going to be moderated by Naomi Hafter. Please post your questions in the chat so that Naomi can address them to Professor Copulsky during the Q&A. If you would like to ask a question verbally during the Q&A, please use the hand raise icon, which is under reactions at the bottom of the screen, and you'll then be called upon in turn. Also, everyone, please take a moment to mute yourselves now so that during the lecture and during the Q&A, when you are not speaking, your screen does not pop up and interrupt the speaker. And one last thing, at the end of the program, it's important that you fill out a questionnaire for tonight's lecture. The link is in the chat. And now it's my pleasure to turn the program back over to Professor Jerome Copulsky, who's going to talk about moving beyond the idea of a Judeo-Christian America.
Great. Well, thanks again, Roger, and it's good to see you all again this afternoon. So as I said in our last discussion, what I'm going to do today is sort of look at the next step in the way in which this phrase Judeo-Christian was used and natural law was used as a way of creating some kind of bond between Americans of different religions. And then maybe in sort of the last part of our conversation, turn to the uncivil religion project that I worked on with Professor Mike Altman at the University of Alabama on the Capitol insurrection, looking at sort of how some of these religious ideas played out in an actual context of the Trump administration and the Stop the Steal rally. I just want to maybe pull back a little bit. You know, we talked in the last session about the way in which American Jews recreated or rethought about Judaism to accommodate the tradition to the realities of living in a modern, liberal, democratic, pluralistic society. And this wasn't something that was new to the Jewish community in America. And in fact, it was something one could say that all religious communities are constantly recreating themselves to have some kind of fit with the larger societies in which they're operating in. There was never a sort of primal, pure, original form of Judaism or Christianity or Islam, for that matter. All these religious traditions have histories that took place in time and in places, and in many ways were shaped by those times and those places, either to fit in better or to stand in opposition to those other communities in which they're living amongst. In the case of modern Judaism, the attempt to think about or to cultivate a form of Jewish belief and practice that had a better fit with modern Enlightenment liberal values and political institutions goes as far back, at least as far back as Moses Mendelssohn in the late 18th century. I mentioned in the first session Mendelssohn's book Jerusalem, or on religious power and Judaism, on religious power and Judaism, and in fact, you know, in the way that we teach modern Jewish thought, Mendelssohn's treatise is kind of the first salvo, the first book of modern Jewish thought. It's interestingly written in German, not in Hebrew. It is written to show, is written in conversation with the political theories that had been set forth by Hobbes and Locke, and as well as Benedict Spinoza. And it is meant to show that Judaism, rightly understood, and the state, rightly understood, are not in tension with one another. Right, that there's not the theological political problem that other Enlightenment thinkers said Judaism presented, and particularly the book Mendelssohn's Jerusalem is haunted by an earlier book by a Jewish writer, or a writer who was excommunicated from Judaism, Baruch Benedict Spinoza, and his theological political treatise. Spinoza argued that Judaism was a kind of state religion. It was a political religion, that the law of the Torah was not just a law of religious practice, but was a kind of national civil law as well. And so long as Jews kept to that law and kept to their messianic hopes, they were essentially living as a political community within a larger political community. And it was the work of people like Moses Mendelssohn and the liberal reformers who came after him to show that, in fact, Judaism, rightly understood, was not in tension with the modern state, that the Jewish community did not comprise a state within a larger state, but that Jewish belief and practice actually helped cultivate ethical citizens, the kind of citizens that were needed to participate in a modern, liberal, ultimately democratic order, right? So that in fact, this goes back, in a way, the argument of Jerusalem is an early formulation of that Judeo-Christian thing that people like Herberg in the mid-20th century were talking about, that Jews practicing Judaism become the very kinds of citizens that a modern polity depends upon. And you could look at, I've written on this. If you're interested, I could send you an article that I wrote many years ago, which sort of traces this idea, particularly through the liberal reformists of the 19th century, but you also see it to an extent in the neo-Orthodox tradition in the 19th century, and you'll see it again in people like Mordechai Kaplan, Milton Steinberg, Will Herberg, of course, Abraham Joshua Heschel. This idea that Judaism, Jewish belief and practice, rightly understood, rather than creates or cultivates a kind of ethical subject that a modern polity depends upon. So that's one way, I think, in a sense, the dominant way that Jews found themselves able to make themselves American or fit into the American scene. Now, there wasn't the only way. Another way was a kind of a separatism that accentuated the distinctiveness of Jewish belief and practice. So the very invention of what we call ultra-Orthodoxy. Ultra-Orthodoxy was not the old-time religion. Ultra-Orthodoxy in Judaism was a response to modernity as well. And it was an attempt by traditionalist Jews to essentially create more and more boundaries between their community and its practices and the modern world, in order to ensure the purity and the stability and the continuity of that community. I mentioned yesterday morning the new book on Kiryat Yoel, the Satmar community in upstate New York, and one of the points that the authors make in that book is that this was not the recreation of a 19th century European shtetl. This was something entirely new. This was an invention of a new form of Jewish living, and it was a new form of Jewish living which could only happen within the legal and political context of modern America, right? So even forms of separatism, even forms of withdrawal, and I'm not only talking about the Jewish community here, but we can look at other communities that have also practiced an attempt to separate themselves out as a community, is also a way of being American, right? It's also a strategy of fitting into this country, just in a different mode, in a different register. So I say that as kind of background for what we're going to go into today, and to give you some resources if you're interested in, particularly in the mid-century, how American Jews began to articulate this Jewish American synthesis, so to speak. So, look at Milton Steinberg's Basic Judaism as a classic text, or look at the works of Abraham Joshua Heschel from the 50s and early 60s. These were attempts by modern Jewish thinkers to present a Judaism that was modern, that allowed Jews to exist in American society, not as a religious minority in tension with that society, but in a way fitting fully within the values of a modern, increasingly liberal, increasingly democratic polity. And then came the 60s. And I think in order to understand how the Judeo-Christian label changed from being this attempt at inclusivity, a way of finding a kind of common denominator for Protestants, Catholics, and Jews and others to all be American, participate in an American civil religion, and in a civil religion that was in a sense a bulwark against godless atheist communism. In order to understand how that term changed from being this inclusive moniker to something today, which I think is actually used in an exclusionary way, as a banner within the American culture wars, we have to look at what happened in the 60s, and how the 60s essentially reshuffled the deck, so to speak, both on the social level, the economic level, the political level, and the religious level in American society. So we can talk about a lot of things. One, we can talk about basic demographic shifts, particularly the changes in demographic patterns that occurred in the wake of the Immigration Act of 1965. So prior to 1965, most immigrants to the United States of America came from Europe, originally from Britain and Northern Europe, and then later from Eastern and Southern and Central Europe. And that was really where most Americans came from, leaving aside indigenous populations, leaving aside the African American population that was brought over with the slave trade, and leaving aside the entrance of people from Asian descent from China and Japan in the mid to late 19th century and following. The immigration law in 1965 changes that. And all of a sudden we begin to see people coming in to the United States as immigrants from East Asia, South Asia, the global South. Right? And this begins to change what America looks like. And it also changes the religious options in America. So now, begin to see a larger contingent of people who are of non-Judeo-Christian faiths, be them Muslims, Buddhists, people of traditional religions from Africa, right? It begins to slowly change the profile. Not a lot, but all of a sudden, America's not 99.9% Judeo-Christian. And also, some of these new religions new religions to the United States become attractive to Americans, Native Americans themselves. Right? So in the mid-60s, Americans start taking an interest in Hinduism and Eastern religions, Hinduism or Buddhism or Islam. We could talk already to jump back a couple of decades, the invention of new forms of religion in the United States. Nation of Islam, the Black Muslims, was an attempt to use the language and symbols of Islam and meld it into the African American experience. And so all of a sudden, Judeo-Christian is not really capturing everything, even if it ever did. And also an increasing secularization of American society. Right? We talked about the Supreme Court cases of 1962 and 63, which began to take out the practice of even a very superficial and broad Judeo-Christian religious language from the schools and from the public sphere. So we have the issue of demographics. We have the issue of civil rights, of course, beginning with the taking apart of the Jim Crow regimes in the South, and the development of integration, both in the South and the North, voting rights, and with the seeming failure or insufficiency of civil rights movement, the emergence of a Black Power movement, first maybe manifest with Nation of Islam and the figure of Malcolm X, but later with groups like the Black Panthers, right? So an assertive African-American liberationist presence in American society. The development of feminism on the national stage and associated issues such as abortion rights. The growing gay liberation movement, the campus struggles, the struggles against the Vietnam War, and another international issue, which had very important effects on sort of the religious shape in the United States, the victory of Israel in the 1967 war, and how Israel's victory in 67, its problem in 73, reshaped how both American Jews and also American Protestants thought about Israel, thought about the Zionist project, thought about the relationship with America and the Jewish state. So I mention all of that because all of those changes amounted to a real shift, kind of a paradigm shift in American society. So by the early 70s, American conservatives who had, spent the period of the Cold War looking at godless communism and fighting, seeing the Cold War as a fundamental religious struggle and civilizational struggle, now began to see that religious and civilizational struggle happening in their own backyards within the United States itself, right? So this is the context for the emergence of what we call the new Christian or the new religious right, that that begins to well up in the mid to late 70s. I think the election of Jimmy Carter as a vocal born again Christian, himself a Southern Baptist, but a more or less liberal Democrat, was seen as a kind of the first sign of the emergence or the reawakening of kind of Christian America. There was great disappointment on the part of conservative Christians with the Carter presidency. By 1976, the once politically withdrawn fundamentalist Jerry Falwell began to hold I Love America rallies in state capitals across the country. And by 1979, he put together what he called the moral majority, which was really the first and maybe the most famous organ of this new Christian right. But notice that he called it the moral majority. And this was an important act of branding on Falwell's part and on the part of the people who supported him. By the way, the people who supported this initiative actually were two Catholics who saw Jerry Falwell and people like Pat Robertson as the face of an awakening religious right that would include not only Protestants, not only evangelicals, but Catholics and also Jews. That's why it was the moral majority. And what they saw that they were doing was an attempt to a response to this changing America and to use the language of the Judeo-Christian for this conservative restorationist agenda. Right? They saw themselves as participating in an exercise in civilizational preservation, what we would now call the culture war. And so we can look at the issues that they brought together, and you can, if you're interested in this particular subject, the center of gravity, the first major manifesto of the religious right was Jerry Falwell's "Listen, America!" ! And I hear in that an echo of Shema Yisrael, right? Listen, Israel, listen, America, because he's going to play in that America as a new Israel theme, and the prophetic critique of America, that he's calling America to account for its sins, or he's going to call a particular group of people to account for undermining the purity of America. So what were the issues? Well, one of the fundamental issues that brought these groups together was abortion. And abortion had long been seen as a Catholic issue. Not too many people realize that in 1973, when Roe v. Wade came down, the Catholics were very unhappy with Roe v. Wade, or conservative Catholics. Conservative Protestants mostly ignored the issue or thought that it was a good decision on religious freedom grounds. So you can go back and you can look at the response of the Southern Baptist Convention to Roe v. Wade, and it's surprising because they were not opposed to it. It's only later in the 70s, partially ginned up by a conservative Presbyterian intellectual named Francis Schaeffer, who did a movie with Dr. C. Everett Koop, who would become the Surgeon General under Reagan, called Whatever Happened to the Human Race, and presented this movie in evangelical venues to really gin up support for the anti-abortion movement. But also people like Jerry Falwell saw abortion as an issue that could allow them to join forces with Catholics, conservative Catholics, and also conservative Jews, and become a wedge issue, particularly in Republican politics. So abortion is one of the issues. Another issue, of course, was feminism, and particularly the Equal Rights Amendment, which was seen as a force that would undermine the patriarchal family in America. So the ERA and the person who was really leading the charge there was a Catholic, Phyllis Schlafly. The push against gay rights, some lingering resentment about the integration, particularly of Christian academies in the South, and the revoking of IRS tax-exempt status from Christian academies that were still segregated. But another issue that was part of this was the issue of Israel, and support for this, and trying to cultivate more American support for the state of Israel. And the Israel issue was a way in which the religious right believed that they can get more Jewish support for their endeavors, for their sort of restorationist, culturally conservative endeavor. Now, those of you who followed evangelical Christianity will know that there were a couple of reasons why evangelical Christians were supportive of Israel. It may surprise you that actually there were Christian Zionists in America probably before there were Jewish Zionists. The notion of Christian Zionism goes back to the late 19th century, and it was part of evangelical prophecy, that there were evangelicals, we call them premillennial dispensationalists, right? So these are people who believed that Jesus was going to come back as predicted in the book of Revelation and the messianic passages of the gospel according to Matthew. Jesus was going to come back, and then was going to, he was going to come back, there were going to be terrible wars, terrible cataclysms, but he's going to come back in victory. And after that, there'll be this 1,000-year reign of peace, the millennium. Okay. So these people were different than post-millennialists, who believe that actually human beings will build up this millennium, this 1,000-year era of peace. And then at the end of that, Jesus would come back. So these are all based on technical interpretations of books of Daniel, parts of Ezekiel, Matthew, book of Revelation, and really is a divide within Protestant Christianity, right? Between those who think Jesus is coming sooner and those who think Jesus is coming later. For those who think Jesus is coming sooner, one of the things that has to happen before Jesus comes is the ingathering of the Jews to the land of Israel, and the recreation of a Jewish state in the temple. And then the bad stuff will happen and Jesus will come back. So already in the 1880s, there are evangelical Christians who are supporting the restoration of the ingathering of Jews to the land of Israel and the restoration of the temple. And they're part of the push for American support, particularly during the early decades of the 20th century. And Jewish leaders like Brandeis worked with them, but also, did not agree with what they believed was going to happen when the Jews got back to the land of Israel. But they saw them as useful allies in the Zionist project. Now, once Israel is established in 1948, all of a sudden, the millennium, the second coming of Christ, feels a lot. It's going to come a lot sooner, right? You have the second coming of, you have the ingathering of Jews to the land of Israel. You have the establishment of a Jewish state. You have this growing Cold War tensions between the United States and the godless Soviet Union. And you can go back and you could read these pamphlets about, reading the book of Revelation and which characters is who. And this becomes an interesting practice within these biblical prophecy circles. Well, this gets radicalized again in 1967, when in a seemingly miraculous victory, Israel captures not only the Sinai Peninsula, but the West Bank, Judea, Samaria, Bible land, right? That's really where the Bible took place, not in Tel Aviv, not in Haifa, but Judea. So all of a sudden, those prophecies of the Bible seem as though they are unfolding in our very day. And the sort of classic text, which was sort of articulating this view, was Hal Lindsey's late great Planet Earth, which was one of the best-selling books, not only Christian books, but best-selling books, period, in the early 1970s. So on the one hand, there's this support for Israel as a kind of participating in this end times drama, right? This play that's being worked out in history. We see it happening, and we're participating in it by supporting the right team. On the other hand, there were and not these weren't mutually exclusive positions. There were those Christians who were supporting the Jewish project in Israel. Because they read, there's a verse in the book of Genesis where God blesses Abraham and says, I bless you and your descendants, and those who bless you, I will bless, right? So by blessing Abraham and his descendants, you will gain the blessing, you're promised the blessings of God as well. So these forces come together. And so when the religious right begins to manifest its political power in the late 70s and early 80s during the Reagan administration, there's a kind of opening for Jews to at least participate with them, to link arms, to march with them, particularly those who also shared their conservative values, their social conservative values, which I expressed particularly regarding abortion issue, feminism, gay rights, but also the religious right had signed on to some boilerplate Republican policies as well. So low taxation, low deregulation, higher military spending, and a bellicose stance towards the Soviet Union and the communist world. So now all of a sudden, we have this change of what Judeo-Christian America stands for, right? It's no longer this inclusive project, this inclusive kind of civic religion, these biblical values or what kind of shape us or underwrite the democratic project. Now it is about a description of choosing sides in a culture war. And this may become even more manifest as we move into the 90s after the collapse of the Soviet Union, where Americans now face a different spiritual political enemy, right? Islam, political Islam. Already, this was already sort of coming to fore in the late 70s with the Iranian Revolution and the coming of the Ayatollah Khomeini and his gaining power, taking power in Iran, the hostage crisis, but by the early 90s, Islam is now seen as the international threat to America, displacing godless communism. So the Judeo-Christian now was narrowing the scope of who is a real American. right? And I mentioned this. I want to remind you of the sermon we talked about at the end of our discussion yesterday, from George Daugherty at the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church, and why he said "under God." And in that sermon, he included Muslims in that fabric, in that sacred canopy of American believers. By the time you get to the 90s, Muslims seem to fall out, and there's great sort of skepticism about whether Islam can be part of the American project. And to counter that, more liberal religious leaders in Protestantism, Judaism, Catholicism begin talking of not of a Judeo-Christian conversation, but of an Abrahamic tradition, right? So pulling back, trying to find a term which would capture those of the biblical faith, but those who participate more broadly in an Abrahamic tradition as a kind of a tri-faith conversation. And so, by the 90s and early 2000s in interfaith circles, you will hear discussions of Abrahamic values, Abrahamic tradition, right? Essentially doing that kind of political expansion work that the Judeo-Christian was doing in the 30s and 40s. So where does that leave us today? Again, even with that Abrahamic faith, right, we're still leaving out a whole lot, right? We're leaving out those who are Buddhists, those who are Hindus, those who are of other Sikhs, Jains, those of other religious traditions, right, neo-pagans, what have you, those of no religions, the nuns, right, the secularists, right? So can we even think of, does the any attempt to cultivate a civil religion even work? And it was interesting that one of the places I saw this struggle was in the speeches of Barack Obama, when he was a senator and also when he was inaugurated president in 2009. And now Obama's political career was shaped by his commitment to the Black church. He was a convert to the Black church. It was part of his own political and cultural formation was to join a Black church in the South Side of Chicago. And he was very good. He was very comfortable in using the language of that Black church, framed by the language of his liberalism. Remember, he's a Harvard-trained lawyer, to try to mediate that culture war, or try to tamp down some of the tensions within that culture war. And there were those in what we called the religious left in the early mid 2000s who were part of this project, essentially saying, why are we letting these right-wing, conservative, reactionary culture warriors essentially take the claim to be the authentic Christians or Catholics or Jews when we are also motivated by our faith? And we were motivated by our faith for civil rights. We're motivated by our faith for the anti-war movement. We're motivated by our faith for social justice, right? Why doesn't the Democratic Party allow us to use the language of faith when the Republican Party now seems to be the party of God? So Barack Obama was part of that conversation. He gave a very interesting speech to Sojourners, which is a progressive evangelical group, saying that Democrats and liberals need to begin to feel more comfortable, not only speaking in the language of faith in the public realm, but also be more comfortable people of faith themselves, right? To see that one doesn't need to make a hard and fast distinction between one's public presentation and one's private religions. Now, he wasn't trying to, he was very careful to say, I still believe in separation of church and state. I don't think we should have a theocracy. We shouldn't have established church, but arguing that that religious values do indeed undergird political activity, and going back to the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King Jr.'s leadership was the perfect example. So when he was elected president, I was very interested to see how he would expressed these ideas during his inauguration speech. We talked about how inauguration speeches are very important, particularly in the discourse of civil religion. We looked at how John F. Kennedy used this kind of language, this kind of vague Judeo-Christian God language, as a way of expressing an American civil religion in conflict with the Soviets. And Barack Obama didn't disappoint. And if you go back and you look at that speech, he does mention the religion, but he's very careful to talk about the great sort of vast landscape of American religion, America's religious pluralism, which is its strength, right? So he talks about Protestants and Catholics and Jews and Muslims and Buddhists and even the nuns, right? Even those who do not claim a faith are part of this, rejecting the argument that the nuns, the secularists, are parasites on some Judeo-Christian foundation. So it's an interesting speech to go look at in that context. An even more interesting speech by Barack Obama was his so-called race speech, which he gave in April of 2008 during the horse race with Hillary Clinton. Now you remember he converted, he became a Christian in the Black church, and the leader of his church was Jeremiah Wright. And in the spring of 2008, during the campaign, some sermons of Jeremiah Wright, or clips of sermons, I should say, were released and played over and over again on TV, on cable TV. And those sermons were the opposite, seemed to be the opposite of civil religion. You may remember Jeremiah Wright proclaiming God damn America, right? God damn America for its sins against Native Americans, for its sins against Blacks, for its wars, for its right. So this was played over and over again. Barack Obama had to respond. He gave this very long and interesting speech on race, trying to explain it. Many commentators of religious studies tried to explain it as well and looked at Jeremiah Wright's speech of God damn America and said, this is actually nothing new. Jeremiah Wright's speech is deeply within the tradition of the American Jeremiah, the complaint against America's sins, which goes all the way back to the Puritans, right? It goes actually all the way back to Jeremiah. It goes all the way back to the biblical prophets. It becomes an American discourse with the Puritans. And you heard it in the religious right after 9/11. Jerry Falwell on Pat Robertson's TV program blamed America for its sins, for God taking away the protective curtain and allowing the hijackers to attack America. Right? Who were the sinners in America? They were the gays, the feminists, the abortionists, the ACLU, the secularists, what have you, but it was still America was being punished. So many religious commentators said that's what Jeremiah Wright Jr. is doing. But I went back and actually looked at the sermon to see if that's what he was doing, right? The idea is that America has a special relationship with God, and when America keeps its side of the bargain, right, keeps the covenant, God will bless America and Americans will prosper. And when America sins and goes against what God wants, God will punish America, right? That's the reward and the Deuteronomistic reward and punishment biblical frame. I went back to see if that's what Jeremiah Wright was saying, and it wasn't. It wasn't a Jeremiah. What Jeremiah Wright was saying is that it is sinful, it is wrong for any nation, whether it's the Rome, whether it's Japan, whether it's Russia, whether it's Germany, whether it's the British Empire, where it's the United States, to think that they are in a special relationship with God. No nation is in that special relationship with God. That's a mistake, right? This whole idea that we can have this covenantal relationship with God is a misunderstanding of the Bible, according to Jeremiah Wright. That was really at the core of his sermon. And actually that's why his sermon was even more radical, I think, than its defenders and critics said it was. So where do we go from here with this inclusive, exclusive thing? I don't have an answer for you. I think what we have seen since the presidency of Barack Obama is that the culture war has not ended, but it is radicalized. The tensions that he was rhetorically trying to diffuse back in the mid-2000s are now at a higher pitch in American society than they've ever been. The Judeo-Christian term, when it is used, I think is really used in an exclusionary fashion by politicians. I think politicians on the left of center, when they do use religious language, will use it much more, will be careful to use it much more broadly than not, and they still use it, right? That you can go and listen to Joe Biden's speeches, and Joe Biden is very comfortable using a civic religious rhetoric, which comes from his own Catholicism. But he's very careful not to use it in the kind of culture war way that you hear it from the right. You can listen to almost any speech by a Republican actor today, and when they mean Judeo-Christian, they mean it in the way in which it was framed in the late 70s by people like Falwell, not in the way it was being framed in the 50s by people like Herberg. So I think that's maybe a good place to maybe pause my comments for a moment. We have, I think, about 20 minutes, which will allow us some time for discussion on this, and then maybe I can take you into how I saw this play out in some of the images and videos on January 6th. So I think we have a moderator, but Alan, I think your hand is up, so I'll start with you.
Thank you. Great 3 sermons, great presentations. I think people should be hearing this across the board. I just want to personalize it again. As I mentioned before the whole session started today, I did some research on the Engel versus Vitale decision, which happened in the school system that I grew up in. And one thing I found out, I was up very late last night, is what had caused the families to be able to speak up. I'd like you to address that a little bit, because especially the Engel family, they had cross burnings on their lawn. This is in my community that I grew up, and I always thought of it as a liberal community. Okay, they had threatened calls, the telephone. It's not just their family, but almost all the families had to go through this. And this probably happens time and time again. These are our real martyrs for keeping the civil religion alive. And we should be really thankful for what they have done in order for us to have this discussion today. I'm wondering if you have any, reactions on, we need to hear these stories of the people that have been able to speak out on our behalf.
Yeah, so I'm gonna, I think it's important. We read these cases, and you're reading these very technical things about, does this activity go over the line or not go over the line, and and legal theorists and scholars are engaged in this very abstract conversation. But you're right, it's about real people, and it's about it's about their kid, what are their kids learning, or today, the whole conversation is critical race theory and what are we teaching our kids in schools. This was what our kids learning in schools. They're being forced to say a prayer, which is fundamentally a Christian prayer, or they're being forced to read the Bible. But whose Bible? Whose translation? What passages of the Bible? Right. So this was, in a sense, these parents were like, we want, these are the public schools, and we think that our religion is a matter of our private teaching, and we want to have control over that, and we don't trust having these particular teachers do it, and we don't want our kids to feel, look, if you're a kid and all your friends are saying the prayer, the opting out doesn't work. All of a sudden, you're marked out as different, right? Now I want to give a turn of the screw, because these were the later discussions about secularizing the schools. There were earlier school cases in the 40s, which had to do with a different religious tradition and a different problem. That problem was the Pledge of Allegiance the Pledge of Allegiance prior to the addition of under God. So just a plain old one, Pledge of Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And there was a religious group that was like, we can't do that because that is idolatry. And that group was the Jehovah's Witnesses. And boy, the Jehovah's Witnesses were really not liked. And they also endured violence and threats of violence for their religious right not to participate in what they saw to be a patriotic ritual, which was a violation of their religion. Interestingly, there were 2 court cases on it. The first one they lose, and the second one they win. And the one they lose, who writes the majority opinion? A Jewish justice, Felix Frankfurter, who argues that in fact the state has an interest in cultivating that practice against the religious freedom claim of the families. And that gets reversed soon after, gets reversed a couple of years later. But that's really the kind of, if we're going to talk about sort of martyrs, people who are martyrs for, religious freedom, sometimes we have to look at religious traditions that we may not like. I mean, it's often the religious traditions that we may not like who are going to be on the front line of those fights. So I think it's a great point. All right, so I know we have a moderator, so I'm gonna let the moderator tell me who's next. And Naomi, you have to unmute.
Thank you. Dovan, Hannah next, and I have 2 questions in the chat from Amit. So that will be our order. And Jerome, Jerry, feel free to rock on as best as you can. It's okay.
All right.
Okay, so can you hear me?
Yep.
So first of all, just listening to you is fascinating, and thank you. But so my concern is, you're talking about the religious right in this country, and from what you're saying and from what I know, they're having an undue influence, at least in my view, on what is happening in terms of public policy and foreign policy, public health, and so on. So when I compare and the United States to, say, Western countries, I see a difference. I see that in Western countries, people are less religious. If you just look at the number of churchgoers in the United States versus other countries, if you look at abortion in Western countries, in most Western countries, there are very few restrictions for abortion. So why is it that it seems to be that in the United States, religion is playing a bigger role in policy, and in other countries, it's playing lesser role? And the other issue, which I think is very important, is it seems that the religious right, to a large extent, is anti-science. So, you had before this the discussion about evolution, but during the pandemic, you also had many pastors, religious leaders, including, I'm sorry to say, some Jewish religious leaders that were anti-vaxxers. And so what I see is this country going in the wrong direction because of the influence of the religious right.
Yeah, so there's a lot there. Let me take a couple stabs at it. There's a conversation about why is America a more religious society, generally speaking, than Western countries in Western Europe. And one of the reasons that is given for that is that Western Europe kept their establishments. And so for the most part, so in England, the Church of England is still the official religion. In Scandinavia, the Lutheran churches are still in charge. The Catholic Church had been very powerful in France and Spain and Portugal. In Spain and Portugal and Italy, the Catholic Church was bound up with the fascist regimes there. And so one of the arguments is, in a way, religion in Western Europe gets discredited because of its intimacy with the state, with politics. And so people, and there wasn't the space for there to be a kind of libertarian religious marketplace, right? In the United States, once you get rid of the establishment, once the state says, we're not funding anybody, all of a sudden it's anything goes. right? So all of a sudden, all of the religious interests or energies and passions of the population could go wherever it wants. And that's why you see the emergence of so many new sects, and then sects on top of sects, and then new religious movements, right? Because there's the freedom to do that. So I think that that's one side of it. There's also the side in which American conservative politics gets, and conservative politics and particularly the relationship of economic interests gets rolled into religious interests. There's been some scholarship, this will not surprise you, but a lot of fundamentalist religion or conservative religion in Protestantism, but also in Catholicism and Judaism, gets a lot of support from very deep-pocketed individuals. And I can give you a couple, I'll give you just 3 completely separate examples of this. One, you've heard of fundamentalist Christianity, Protestantism. The reason we have this term is because in the early 20th century, a group of evangelical Christians started putting out books called the Fundamentals, which were essays to show the truths of their understanding of conservative Protestantism against the modernists on things like the inerrancy of the Bible, the truth of certain Christian dogmas, the falsity of Darwinism, and so on and so forth. Those booklets, those publications were sent free across the country and probably across the pond as well to pastors and YMCAs and things like that. It was funded by the Standard Oil people. Like essentially they were what today would be billionaires foot the bill to put these books out into the public. And this happened also in the 70s. There's a lot of sort of business money that was interested in promoting conservative Christianity. You can look at places like Ave Maria University, a conservative Catholic college, and I think there's a law school as well down there in Florida, which was funded by the Domino's pizza guy. You could look at, because I'm going to be fair and ecumenical, groups like the Tikva Foundation, which fund conservative Jewish programming, right? So on the one hand, there's a way in which there's a kind of a free reign of religion, and so religion itself is not does not kind of get the dirt of politics. But on the other hand, there are ways in which particular religious groups get a lot of funding and get a lot of reach because of the interest of their donors. So those are my, I guess, 2 stabs at that issue. Okay, so in the chat, there were 2 questions from Amit. What is the origin of the National Prayer Breakfast, and could the civil rights movement and current BLM movement happen without the church? Origin of the national, you want to talk perfect transition. The National Prayer Breakfast was funded by essentially conservative Protestant businessmen. There's a book that came out about maybe a bit more than 10 years ago, maybe 12, 14 years ago, by a guy named Jeff Charlotte, called The Family, which is a history and expose of this group called The Family, which is this network of business leaders and politicians and activists. This came together in the 1950s in the Eisenhower era, in the height of this American civil religion, but it was meant to cultivate a particular kind of American Christianity, a pro-business, pro-capitalist Christianity. The other book, if you're interested in the origins and the relationship of business, capitalism, and conservative Protestantism, look at Kevin Kruse's One Nation Under God. He's a historian at Princeton, and he's written extensively on that issue as well. Civil rights movement and BLM without the church. No, the black church, the civil rights movement was a social but also a religious movement. It really got a lot of its energy from the black church, which is not to say that the black church was uniformly behind the civil rights movement. There were many black pastors who opposed what Martin Luther King Jr. and his colleagues were doing, but the center of gravity for the civil rights movement, particularly in the 50s and early 60s, was within the Black church itself. And in fact, there are interesting questions within the Black church about whether there's the tension within the Black church, on the one hand, striving for justice, on the other hand, striving for a kind of ethic of forgiveness and a kind of political quietism. And there were those within the Black church who felt that they were losing ground to more aggressive African Americans like Malcolm X and the Black Power movement. So in the late 60s, early 70s, there emerged a center in the Black church of Black liberation theology, Black theology, people like James Cone, to essentially argue that there was a stronger demand for liberation and justice in the Black church that was not that needed to be highlighted, and that the African American Christianity should not just be understood as African Americans beholden to the religion of whites, of the slave owners. I think it'd be interesting to see how much of that is in the BLM movement. There are a lot of churches, both African American churches and also sort of white churches or mixed churches that support the BLM movement and see it as in this tradition of seeking liberation and justice. So I think that a place to go, those who are interested in that, there's a wonderful essay in the 1619 Project book that just came out by Anthea Butler, who's a professor of church history at the University of Pennsylvania. And she has this wonderful essay sort of playing on that tension within the Black church between a kind of ethic of forgiveness and an ethic of justice and liberation.
Joel Shurkin has a question. Joel, why don't you just unmute and ask your question?
Okay. One of the phenomenons that always amazed me was a man named Charles Coughlin, who was a Roman Catholic priest. In the 1930s, he had a national radio program, which had at one time 30 million listeners. Radio was his principal medium of the time, and 30 million listeners would make the people at Fox News weep out of jealousy. He was a raging anti-Semite on the air and off the air. And what always interested me or amazed me is the fact that one of the national networks, that I think was NBC, had this guy on once to do his anti-Semitic sermons at least once a week. And I know anti-Semitism existed even particularly then, but I don't understand how he became normal.
Yeah, he was a fascist, and he starts off actually being a New Dealer and supporting FDR, and he turns against FDR and becomes a kind of populist, anti-Semitism, protocols of the Elders of Zion, all of that, pro-Hitler rhetoric is all part of that. I'm not sure I know enough about who was to comment. I know at some point he's kind of pulled off the air, and I'm not sure if it happened.
Under pressure from the Roosevelt administration.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if it happened after we get into the war or prior to that. But he was an exceptionally important voice, and also, coming out of, the Michigan sphere was where Henry Ford was operating, and their complicated anti-Semitic history with Henry Ford and the Dearborn Independent, sort of packaging the protocols of the Elders of Zion for an American audience. So it was that kind of stuff that the Judeo-Christian term was originally created to fight against. So I think it's a good example of that. Heidi Bodenheimer asks, what's my take on Christmas celebrations in secular schools and Christmas celebrations at the White House? Years ago, I think it was 2005 or 2006, I was teaching at Virginia Tech, and I was visiting a friend in DC, and I was driving back. And for those of you who know, it's 250 miles door to door, so 4.5 hour drive. And after a while, for opposition research, I would listen to right-wing radio, and Bill O'Reilly was on. and Bill O'Reilly was complaining about the war against Christmas, right? That all of a sudden people are not able to say Merry Christmas anymore. They have to say Happy Holidays, and like Christmas is being canceled, to use a contemporary term. And I don't think there's war against Christmas, and no one, whenever the Grinch comes on TV, the original Boris Karloff TV special, like I'm going to put it on because I think it's fabulous. But I was like, he was complaining about the secularists who are trying to get rid of Christmas. And I said, I called up and I said, you're concerned about the secularization of America, the secularization of Christmas, but really the people you should be angry with, first of all, you should be angry with the Puritans because they hated Christmas. They banned Christmas. They actually did have a war on Christmas, literally, right? So the Puritans didn't like Christmas. So if we're really going to go back to our Judeo-Christian foundations, we got to get rid of Christmas because it's not in the Bible. But the other people who ruined Christmas was the Senate, who made it a national holiday. And by making Christmas a national holiday, they essentially said that Christmas is not a religious holiday, because if it is a religious holiday, it's an establishment of religion. So they actually secularized Christmas. So if you're angry at Christmas, angry at secularists, get angry at the Congress, because they're the ones who made it into a national holiday. Bill O'Reilly didn't like that, and he ended up hanging up on me. As far as Christmas celebrations at the White House, and Hanukkah celebrations at the White House, and Diwali celebrations, as long as we're doing celebrations at the White House, and they're not endorsements, they're celebrations, that's not a line I'm gonna fight over. I think there's some groups that are very, very militant on drawing the line one way or the other. You want to have a Christmas party, have a Christmas party. You want to have a Hanukkah party, have a Hanukkah party. But I think it does raise issues. But it also shows that wall of separation was always very porous. This is remember what the Liberal League in the 19th century was all up in arms about, that we claim to have a separation of church and state, but we have military chaplains, we have Senate chaplains, we have Christmas parties in the White House. Obviously, we don't have this wall of separation of church and state. Angela Hayes writes, I mentioned secularization and pluralism. Where do I think privatization fits into discussion? Do I think the idea of civil religion will fail by the wayside as it becomes a more personal, private matter? And with the rise of the nuns, will the influence or mention of anything religion cease to exist? I don't think religion is going to cease to exist. I think that the funerals for religion, have been often, but religion's still here. I think that the privatization question is really essential, because one of the things that distinguished Protestantism when it emerged from Catholicism was the emphasis on the religion being a private experience and salvation being a private experience. So that Protestantism, generally speaking, has an easier time with the notion of religion being something that's private and separate in this sphere than, say, Catholicism or even Judaism or Islam, which make stronger public claims about how religion plays out. So, the idea that we can easily separate, a private realm from a public realm, I think it's, it definitely, it's not true to the phenomenon of religion. And B, it also privileges a kind of religion, right? Privileges those religions which are really, which could be kept in those quarters, right? Where religion is seen as the fundamental relationship between you and God. And if you go to Madison's memorial and remonstrance on religion in the 1780s, you have this attempt to say, well, religion's really what's between you and your creator. And so the government doesn't have to be part of it. But if you actually talk to a lot of people about religion actually is a broader, more complicated phenomenon. So the language of privatization might not be the best language that we have to work on. Now, with that said, when we're in the realm of politics and law, there might be another term that we can use. Recently, a Jewish studies scholar at Georgetown University, Jacques Berliner-Blau, published a book on secularism as a political tool, which essentially says that it argues for a kind of separationism, but also realizing that you can never have this complete separation. There can never be a free floating realm of religion and a free floating realm of politics. But somehow religions have to be able to fit within a secular pluralistic polity. So those who are interested in that issue can go there. I think
know that Hannah Golding also has a question.
Great.
So actually, this is a continuation of what Joe asks. I'm trying to understand the increase in anti-Semitism in the recent years, and the people who perpetrate it tend to be more like on the extreme right. There is a lot of attack on Soros and other Jewish philanthropists, and I'm trying to see this link between this increase in anti-Semitism that actually led to shooting and a lot of terrible outcome. And is that taking some of their roots in extreme religion practices?
Yeah, I mean, the relationship of anti-Semitism and religion is a long and really complicated one, both in history of Christianity and the history of Islam. I think if we look at the anti-Semitism that's coming from the far right, I think this is an anti-Semitism that sees Jews as part of a larger conspiracy to undermine their imagined social power. And this is, this, I think, thinking about anti-Semitism in this term goes back to the late 19th century, and actually goes back to the original term anti-Semitism, which was created by a German named Wilhelm Marr, who saw Semitism and created this notion of Semitism as being opposed to and dangerous to Germanism, Deutschdom. And the theories that there is a conspiracy of people working in tandem behind the scenes to control the world and to take what is rightfully, quote unquote, rightfully from the people like the authentic population of the country and dilute their numbers, corrupt their morals, sort of undermine their traditions. And that's really the kind of anti-Semitism that's affiliated with the far right. And that the shooter in Pittsburgh, the Tree of Life Synagogue, what was he angry about and what was he motivated by? Hias, right? Jews who were supporting immigrants, refugees to come to America to dilute America's traditional white Anglo-Saxon stock, right? That was the anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, tied into Soros, tied into globalization, right? All of that. And in a way, that is the modern experience of the kind of anti-Semitic reactionary positions that emerged in the 19th century. Now, there are all lots of other things going on as well that make it new, but I think that's really what's motivating it. And it gets some of its tropes, it gets some of its language, it gets some of its imagery from historical Christian anti-Judaism. But it's not just a religious phenomenon, although they can overlap. And I think one of the places where you see that overlap today is the QAnon movement, right? So you have many evangelical Christians, Christian conservatives who are becoming interested in this QAnon conspiracy theory, and this conspiracy theory is all about elites who are taking the blood of Christian children, who are operating behind the scenes, but they're globalists, right? You can hear that language, even though they may not mention Jews directly or explicitly. So it's a very interesting, very difficult question. I think we're all, Roger, are we almost running out of time here? I feel like I'm always going over my allotted hour.
Yeah, but it's so interesting that it's perfectly fine. But thank you very much. Yes, we are out of time.
All right. Well, thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Do you want to point us to the Uncivil Religion website?
Yes, I'm going to just put it in the chat here. And those of you who are interested in my take, I composed some of the framing material in the introduction, but the essays are all very interesting, and the images and videos are all very disturbing. The one I would point out, particularly in light of of our discussions, is the first essay, first interpretive essay that's written by sociologist Philip Gorski. And the video that he's commenting upon is a video of a young man who's part of the group in the capital of Rotunda. And they have just finished singing the Battle Hymn of the Republic. And if you know anything about the Battle Hymn of the Republic, it's really weird for this bunch of neo-Confederate insurrectionists to be singing what was a song which became a Union song, but which was originally about John Brown, and John Brown's martyrdom. And John Brown, of course, was an insurrectionist, but he was an anti-slavery insurrectionist trying to incite a slave revolt. So it's a very weird video with a very good commentary. So I would urge you to take a look if you're interested.
Okay, well, thank you.
Were you gonna post that link? I'm not seeing it.
Did it go up? I think I just went, did it go up?
Am I missing it?
Oh, sorry, I sent it as a direct message. Hold on.
Oops,
Oops, hold on, I need to send
we've all done that at least many times.
All right, there you go.
Got it, thank you.
Thank
Okay.
you all, and I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to meet you all.
Okay,
Stay
thank you.
safe.
Superb program. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.